What do an inquisitor from the 41st millennium and a politician from the modern day have in common? Well, more than you might think. The Imperium of Man isn't just battling aliens and demons, it's battling itself. And the ways that it's failing are eerily similar to some of the problems that we can see in the real world. In this video, I am going to use a policy-making framework used by governments and organisations in the real world to dissect the internal rot in the Imperium of Man. From the known threats of rebellion and strife to threats that it likes to ignore. I'm going to tear the Imperium apart. In doing so, hopefully, we can learn a little more about the real world too. Don't skip this video if you want to see the grim dark of the 40k galaxy through a brand new and very real lens. In 2002, then United States Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld gave a talk to the media. There, he outlined a part of his decision-making process when determining threats. He didn't invent this decision-making matrix, but it was named after him about 10 years later by the writer Michael Krogerus in The Decision Book. There are 4 quadrants to this decision-making matrix that evaluate degrees of certainty and uncertainty. They are known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and the 4th, unknown knowns, was added by Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek a few years later. I've already spoken about this framework in depth in my previous video on this topic. That video, I go over it in a lot more detail and I talk about some of the external threats to the Imperium using it. So make sure to check it out, it should be linked somewhere below. But in short, this matrix talks about the threats that we know about, threats that might come about based on information that we have but aren't really able to qualify easily, threats that might come out of nowhere, and threats that we really do know about but choose to ignore. In this video, I want to focus more on the internal threats to the Imperium. They are better described by other areas of this policy matrix, but there are of course known threats to the Imperium of Man. We all know that the Imperium is one of the worst places to live in all of fiction. Indeed, the Imperium itself knows fully just how bad things are for the majority of people living on its worlds. One of the most constant and known threats that it has to deal with is that of rebellion. In fact, it is usually the main job of local imperial governors to stamp out rebellion whenever it comes up. The Imperium knows that they will have to deal with people rebelling against it, and so they direct a large amount of their military and enforcement efforts to stamping these constant rebellions out. One of the most interesting parts of the lore of Warhammer 40k is that the majority of the conflicts that the Imperium takes part in are against renegade human forces. Most of the time, these will be planetary governments that have decided they've had enough of the endless tithes or some other aspect of imperial misrule, and they want to go out on their own. We mostly engage with this setting during the various conflicts that happen in this galaxy of eternal war. For the most part, we see the various different factions pitted against one another. This makes sense from a narrative perspective. Games Workshop wants to sell more models from all of its various different factions, even though at times it might seem like they only really want to make and sell more Space Marines. It can be hard to represent human rebel factions in this game. On a galactic scale, there would be an almost limitless variety of forces that could rebel against the Imperium of Man. But that is hard to represent when GW only really makes plastic models for a tiny fraction of the different human cultures in the galaxy. That being said, it would make sense for the Imperium to struggle to maintain its control on its supposed million worlds. There are all sorts of practical issues at play, like the lack of any reliable interstellar communication or the opening of the Great Rift cutting the galaxy in two. But the biggest motivating factor for any rebel in the galaxy is probably the very nature of imperial rule or misrule itself. The Imperium treats its people like insects. I feel like I've probably quoted the 40k intro in nearly every video now at this stage, but it's always worth driving home that to be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. That passage was probably written by Rick Priestley, one of the original writers of the first edition of Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, way back in the 1980s. But it's held up pretty well right up to the current edition, at least in my opinion. There are plenty of reasons why someone would want to rebel against the Imperium that have nothing to do with any sort of alien influence or chaotic corruption. There are characters in the lore that have rebelled purely because they believed it would improve their quality of life. This threat is one that is absolutely known to the Imperium at large. The very fact that the Adeptus Arbites or Arbites exist proves it. These are essentially the Imperium's equivalent to a federalized police force. They are heavily influenced by the judges from the comic series Judge Dredd. Games Workshop would have worked on Judge Dredd figures in the 1980s. with the aforementioned Priestley also helping to create a board game set in that universe. In Warhammer, the Arbites are a highly militarized police force that exists to protect Imperial assets like administratum outposts or anything to do with the collection of the tithe. They will rarely, if ever, involve themselves in local crime, however. So, there are instances in the lore of riots breaking out on Imperial worlds. The Arbites, having seen plenty of destruction, will only get themselves involved once the local administratum workers or property are threatened. This doesn't really endear them well to many on the worlds of the Imperium. Now, I know we can think of plenty of real-world examples of abuses of power by a police force. But for today, I'm going to keep it local, to show how big of a deal and how long-lasting the impact of these abuses of power can be. During the Irish War for Independence, the Royal Irish Constabulary started to struggle with attacks from the newly created Irish Republican Army, or IRA. Their barracks were burned and convoys were ambushed all across the country. In response, the British government set up two highly militarised groups to deal with this threat. The infamous Black and Tans, who wore the tan part of the army uniform and the black part of the police uniform, and the even more devastating auxiliaries, or auxies. These groups were ostensibly under the command of the local police force, but they were armed like soldiers. Indeed, the majority of them were veterans of the First World War. The establishment of both groups actually wound up creating more volunteers for the IRA and massively increased support for the pro-independence cause. This was especially felt in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday. On the morning of Sunday, the 21st of November 1920, under the direction of Michael Collins, an IRA group known as the Squad targeted a network of British spies known as the Cairo Gang. They killed 15 individuals, some of whom were possibly innocents not involved with the British occupation at the time and caught in the crossfire. Later that day, members of these British paramilitary groups entered Croke Park Stadium during a Gaelic football match. They opened fire on the crowd, killing 14 innocent civilians and injuring many more. This event is considered to be a turning point in the Irish War for Independence and is credited as fueling both the Irish nationalist cause and turning international public opinion against Britain during the war. After independence, it was decided in the new Irish state not to have an official police force. Instead, the equivalent is called An Garda Síochána, in English, Guardians of the Peace. They gave up the use of their firearms while on duty shortly after they were created, and 3/4 of them do not regularly carry a firearm even today. There was such a backlash against the brutal policing in Ireland that it helped to convince a whole population to rebel. Then, it impacted the way policing would be done for generations. In the Imperium, of course, everything is dialed up way past 11. The Adeptus Arbites are equipped with some of the most advanced military equipment and weapons it is possible to give an unaugmented human. They exist to defend the interests of the Holy Government on Terra, no matter what the cost is to the local population. They will routinely go out of their way to use extreme prejudice against even the most mundane discretion to imperial rule or property. In reality, they do this because it's fiction and Games Workshop has to make things as grim and as dark as possible. In the setting, though, they are just one of the more dramatic of countless possible reasons as to why an imperial citizen would want to rebel against the God Emperor. In such a setting, with so many serious threats to the Imperium from both without and within, the Arbites are armed to the teeth. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy with the Arbites. The more they see people disrespect the imperial law, or lex, then the stronger their retaliation will be. Then people will possibly be more motivated to skirt the law, and so on the cycle goes. But with the Imperium, the issue rarely, if ever, seems to be that they don't see any backstabbing. It's that they often don't know where it will come from. The lore is littered with countless individuals who will go out of their way to be as paranoid as possible. Indeed, paranoia seems to be an endemic and encouraged cultural tradition in the Imperium of Man, at least on most of the worlds that we see. And like most people who are paranoid, they will wind up creating an issue, even if it wasn't there before. Then again, there are also times when the paranoia turns out to be justified. Yes, they actually might be out to get you. During the Horus Heresy series, we are introduced to the Ultramarine Sergeant, later promoted, Aenid Thiel. He was marked for censure for theorising on combats between other Space Marines. This action was seen as criminal and borderline treasonous by his superiors. And yet, it turns out he was totally justified. When the Horus Heresy finally broke, the 500 worlds of Ultramar were devastated, and Thiel found himself to be, unfortunately, vindicated. For the Imperium, possibly the greatest known-unknown threat is that of traitor Space Marines. The Horus Heresy is by far the worst example of it. Fully half of the Space Marine legions turned against the Emperor. Not only was the newly won Imperium devastated, but this action had unintended consequences for millennia. Like here in Ireland, changes were made to the way in which the security forces of the Imperium were to be organised. No longer were Space Marines to be grouped together in whole legions. Instead, they were divided into much smaller chapters. The Imperial Army was also divided into the Imperial Guard and Navy. All of this meant that no single individual would be able to command as much military strength as some of the commanders during the Horus Heresy. In the Imperium of the 42nd millennium, the Space Marines are often worshipped by the common Imperial citizenry. It's rare that most people will ever come across any. Most people know them as the Emperor's Angels of Death, and they're often treated like angels, even those that don't have that word in their chapter name. The Imperium expects traitors, or at the very least expects that Imperial subjects could turn against it. This happens all the time, and when it does, one of the first ports of call is to the various Space Marine chapters. It's very rare that an Imperial organisation has any real authority over any Space Marines, though it does happen. Instead, they have to petition as many Space Marines as they can for aid. Whatever chapter has jurisdiction over that area, or happens to be nearby, will usually answer said call for aid. The Imperium seems to be able to accommodate, or at least plan, for rebellions from regular human forces, but they seem to struggle against rebellious groups of Space Marines. This is something that the Imperium seems incapable of predicting. One of the worst instances of this happened to the Astral Claws chapter of Space Marines, led by the now infamous Luft Huron. The Astral Claws are one of a handful of chapters designated as the Maelstrom Warders. These were chapters assigned to protect Imperial worlds around the Maelstrom. This was a permanent warp storm that was essentially a smaller version of the Eye of Terror. As such, it was used by various renegades, traitors, and other chaos forces, among plenty of others. They found sanctuary there and used the cover of the warp storm to launch attacks against the nearby worlds of the Imperium. Over the course of a long period of time, the strength of these warders was slowly taken away by the central government of Terra. They deemed that these forces were more needed elsewhere. As such, Luft Huron and the Astral Claws grew frustrated that they couldn't properly protect this important area of Imperial space. This led to the Badab War. During this conflict, several Space Marine chapters and dozens of worlds seceded from the Imperium, and the area saw one of the most brutal conflicts in Imperial history. It's important to note here that some of the traitor forces were more guilty than others. Some of the chapters only sided with the Astral Claws out of a sense of honour to other Space Marines, thinking that they were treated unfairly by Terra. And that's true. The Astral Claws were treated unfairly by Terra. They rebelled against a government that refused to help them or listen to them despite countless years of sacrifice and service. The Astral Claws survived the conflict, but now they are the Red Corsairs warband of Chaos Space Marines. They are considered to be one of the most dangerous threats to the Imperium. They were even able to, however briefly, capture the Primarch Rabute Guilliman himself. Traitorous Space Marines are a threat that should be reasonably expected by the Imperium at large. Sometimes Marines will turn coat from bad treatment. Other times they will feel forced to help those outside of the Imperium out of a sense of honour. There are plenty of forces in the Imperium that will have little trust in the Space Marines after all of this betrayal. The Custodes will refuse to stand within a spear's length of any of them. There is even an entire Ordo of the Inquisition that oversees the Adeptus Astartes. But by and large, the Space Marines are a threat to the Imperium that they seem unable to quantify. The Ordo Astartes only has about 50 members, and keeping a Marine a spear's length away seems really more of a poetic reaction than anything else. Rebellions in general are an expected part of life in the Imperium, but when the Astartes rebel, the whole Imperial system gets put in jeopardy. It's something that many on Terra definitely know about, but the specifics seem to be always totally unpredictable. But what about a threat you cannot predict at all? There are plenty of threats that come out of nowhere for the Imperium of Man. There are some obvious examples of Xenos races that have come out of seemingly nowhere to devastate Imperial worlds. In my first video on this topic, I mentioned how Necron tombs will often reawaken underneath human settlements that have been there for generations. I've also gone into detail on the first Tyranid invasion, definitely being an unknown threat. But for the Imperium of Man, arguably one of the greatest of these threats has to be the possibility of a demon invasion. Yes, there are plenty of people in the Imperium that know about these, and they have entire bodies of their military devoted to stopping them happening in the first place. But one of the reasons why the Imperium is so brutal in its persecution of any rebellion is that they may, even just possibly, lead to a demonic or chaotic invasion. These invasions are the ultimate form of this kind of threat. It usually cannot be anticipated at all. There are a few, if any, past experiences that can help deal with proper chaos threats. I'm sure we all remember something similar playing out with the various governmental responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, there have been major outbreaks of diseases in the past few decades, and there was a global pandemic about 100 years ago at the end of the First World War. But this virus was really unpredictable. It spread rapidly, and there were no real frameworks that existed that were able to deal with this strange and invisible threat. This led to governments around the world reacting in ways that were sometimes seen as harsh, widespread, and even unpredictable and contradictory. Lockdowns, travel bans, and strict enforcement of public health measures were things that many had never experienced before. Some of them were severe. Here in Ireland at their height, we weren't allowed to travel more than 2 kilometres away from our homes. In reality, these measures were taken to limit people's socialisation and to limit the spread of a novel virus. A virus that did kill about half as many people in a couple of years as some of the estimates for the total deaths during the First World War. However, similar to the Imperium's harsh policies often leading to more rebellion, these measures, while either necessary or at the very least deemed necessary by people in charge, had unforeseen consequences. There was a huge backlash against many of these policies, and they furthered an already existing distrust in public institutions and bodies. Societal divisions have been made worse. Even mentioning COVID has probably given some viewers of this video a strong emotional reaction. Some viewers might not agree with how I described my government's reaction to COVID. Even people who have never been to Ireland or know nothing about it might have a strong opinion about what I've just said. Some might think that the reaction was far too harsh, and some not nearly harsh enough. We can all remember people losing their faith in government and or their own society during the response to COVID-19. Some people went so far as to protest the lockdowns and restrictions or even take unproven and under-regulated supposed cures. There are people now who disregard everything that their government says because some of the things institutions and politicians said turned out to be wrong or even just inaccurate. Entirely new forms of societal friction and internal strife exist now that could not have been anticipated in January 2020. And yet these measures, authoritarian though they may have been, were introduced to avert disaster. Millions have died from COVID, and hundreds of millions more have recovered. But though the worst of the disaster was probably avoided, it has created longer-term social instability. In the Imperium, these demonic invasions are devastating, and entire worlds and cultures have been lost to them. Their potential danger means that the imperial authorities have to persecute any internal threat with as much prejudice as possible. This in turn has created more internal strife. This strife has led to more rebellions. These rebellions have led to more chaotic corruption and the potential for more demonic invasions. The Imperium is run on a self-perpetuating cycle of paranoia and brutality. Fortunately, however, demons aren't real, and neither is the Imperium of Man. As bad as the measures against COVID may have been, and as bad as the societal problems they have helped to exacerbate are, I don't think that we will have to deal with anything as intense as a demon invasion. But like all nations, states and societies out there, there are plenty of problems and threats that those in the Imperium know about, but simply refuse to acknowledge. In the novel Genefather by Guy Haley, we get to see the trial of one of the more interesting characters in the setting, Belisarius Cawl. Cawl is a high-ranking Magos of the Mechanicus, essentially the sister empire of the Imperium that worships technology and the machine god. I'm going to spoil a little bit of the plot of this novel, just FYI. Cawl gets put on trial for crimes against the Mechanicus and their god. His accuser claims that he was conducting heinous acts of scientific research and creating new knowledge. This is against the tenets of their faith. The Mechanicus believes that all knowledge has already been created and it is their duty to merely rediscover said knowledge. They focus their efforts on finding lost technology and equipment around the galaxy. Those that do pursue things like science are punished. Cawl gets away with his actions. He claims that he was merely recreating the steps that ancient humanity would have used to create their knowledge and make their discoveries in the first place. He really is carrying out scientific experimentation. He frames it in a way to escape prosecution for his actions, though there are still plenty of Adeptus Mechanicus, adepts and magos that disagree with him and hate him as a result. The creation of any new knowledge is seen as not just taboo in the Imperium, but an outright crime. There are reasons for this, of course. The cybernetic revolt, where artificial intelligences rebelled against their human masters, was devastating, and AI is still illegal in human space, even though this revolt happened thousands of years before the establishment of the Imperium. But this culture encourages decay. Advanced knowledge and technology is jealously guarded by the organization that functionally has a monopoly on its creation and use. The restriction of knowledge is pervasive throughout pretty much the entire of imperial society. Knowledge is power, after all. In a society that is as paranoid as the Imperium, it can also be dangerous, but not necessarily in the way that we might think at first. It's not only bad for one group of people to have access to the construction of advanced equipment that they can refuse to use for arbitrary reasons. It might also be dangerous to even just know about certain things. If an Imperial Inquisitor is doing the rounds and discovers that someone knows about the existence of certain chaos cults or practices, then that person becomes more of a suspect to their investigations than they might otherwise be. If you know about the existence of a surviving AI or abominable intelligence, then you will likely be arrested and killed for possessing said knowledge, or at the very least, have your memory wiped after the authorities use it to find said AI. If you are ignorant of the greater universe, or even just many aspects of the world around you, you are safer from further scrutiny by the Imperial authorities. Ignorance is encouraged in the Imperium. Sure, there are benefits to this for the Imperium. People are less likely to question the social order and government. Demon invasions and rebellions might be less likely to happen if people don't question those in power. But this is only ever a temporary solution. The Imperium is degrading, and this is something that even characters within the setting are aware of. In the first novel of the Bequin series, Pariah by Dan Abnett, we can see a character holding an ancient toy. It was a replica of a Soviet rocket. So this artifact was either contemporary to the USSR, or it was created by someone who would have known about the first spacefaring human civilization. This character mentions how the past is laughing at the Imperium and how backwards they are, which is true. As an audience, we were supposed to laugh, or at least scoff, at how backwards and regressive the Imperium is. It's something that's played up for the drama and the aesthetic of the setting. Many of the problems that the Imperium has to deal with are the result of this decay. It creates a quality of life so bad that many people living on Imperial worlds are treated like insects by their government. This decay is noticed by many in the setting. In plenty of novels and stories, we will follow a main character who is quick to point out how much better things could have been done by giving the example of how well-run things used to be in previous human civilizations. This is a quick and effective way for the writers to make us positively engage with these characters, and it makes them stand out from the rest of the people we see who are zealous in their ignorance. But this ignorance and degradation exists, and eventually it becomes hard to ignore. Imperial worlds and their infrastructure gradually degrade in their quality. But the expectation of things like the tithe stays the same. Worlds still must pay their taxes to the central imperial authority, even if everything else starts to fall apart. This creates fertile ground for those who would foment rebellion, or even just seditious thought against the Imperium. Gene stealer and chaos cults will often take advantage of this situation. They will encourage people to look at the obvious ways in which their lives are getting worse or are already horrible, and they will try to direct the ill will of the masses to their advantage. I know the deprivations of chaos and the destruction of the Tyranids is usually far worse for the average Imperial citizen, but the Imperium's internal decay facilitates the success of these insidious forces. It's this culture that encourages ignorance and ultimately discourages people from engaging with the issues that they can see in front of them. Ultimately, it further fuels this cycle of aggression and repression. Are there examples of this in the real world? Of course. I'm sure that there are plenty of examples that are already coming to mind for plenty of you listening to this. There are far too many for me to talk about here. Climate change is a strong one. There is now no real argument against man-made or anthropogenic climate change being real. Evidence started to be noticed by oil companies about 50 years ago. These days, we get more extreme weather every year, and more societies around the world will continue to get destabilized and negatively impacted as their climates change. This is something that we can all see, but enough people either choose not to acknowledge or have been encouraged not to acknowledge by the globalized society that we all live in. I don't really want to talk about this example though. I want to talk about something that already happened and is largely finished. The slums of Dublin. Look, it's where I'm from. That's why you keep getting all these Irish stories, by the way, lads, okay? So a little backstory here. Dublin was one of the wealthiest cities in the world in the 1700s. It had the biggest port in the world by 1800. Grand and beautiful houses were built all over the city in this Georgian period. Many of them are actually still standing. In fact, Dublin in the 1950s looked very similar to the 1700s. The wealth left. Most people didn't have access to it. It was a very unequal society. In the 1800s, we joined the UK, and most of the political, cultural and business leaders left for London. Then, in the 1840s, the city was flooded with refugees, fleeing the countryside and the worst impacts of the Great Hunger. Over 1 million people died of hunger and disease in less than 10 years, while millions of tons of food left the country. The wealthy that stayed in Ireland fled the centre of Dublin to new suburbs outside of the city. The old, grand Georgian townhouses, initially built for one wealthy family, often had 10 poor families in them by the end of the 1800s. By 1900, Dublin had the worst slums in Europe. People in Ireland were famously unhappy with British rule, but very few people actually wanted a war with their large neighbours across the Irish Sea. Yet, in 1916, a relatively small group of rebels staged a rebellion in the centre of this densely packed city. The British reaction to this Easter Rising was considered extreme by the people of Dublin and Ireland as a whole. The executed rebel leaders have become great national heroes, even though they were often considered controversial or even unpopular during their lives. But the densely packed city centre was shelled by the British Army and a gunboat on the River Liffey. This action is the one that really radicalised a lot of people and turned more over to the side of the rebels. Many lost their homes, their businesses, and hundreds of innocent people lost their lives. In the aftermath of Irish independence, the new government decided to start moving people out of these tenements. They were slow to do this at first. They only started after a number of collapses. But starting in the 1950s, they created new homes for these communities, largely designed by the English-born architect George Sims. These new communities all around the city have often been criticised, and rightly so. They were far from perfect. They lacked access to proper amenities like schools and transport links, among many others. People of my parents' generation especially think very little of them. But moving people from these slums into whole new communities is one of the biggest improvements to the quality of life in my country's history. It was an action that required our leaders to look at challenges that had already been seen by previous leaders, see what difficulties people were dealing with at the moment, and try to foresee what people might have to face down the line, even after they were no longer in charge. It's a part of Irish history that I'm actually quite proud of, even though it was far from perfect. It's also something that I think we need to see a lot more of. People in charge actually took proactive action against an issue. They didn't just fob it off and react to the consequences of inaction and put the blame on those suffering as a result of said inaction. Now, while I'd like to think that we'll be able to see at least a few more policies like these in the real world, I don't think that we'll see much of them in the grim darkness of Warhammer 40k. After all, that universe is one where hope always leads to disappointment. So today we've seen how the Imperium's own flaws can be, at least at times, its greatest enemy. But there are also many more layers to the struggles that the Emperor's subjects have to face. There are also many more parallels to draw from our own world. If you're hungry for more deep dives into lore and the real world like this, please make sure to like the video, share it, and subscribe. It really does help this channel. Also make sure to hit the notification button to know when the next video comes out. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I know that I've left some stuff out, probably lots of stuff. If the topics I raised in this video remind you of anything in the real world or otherwise, please let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you, and I really do read every comment on this channel. Otherwise, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.